kill, excuse me, to harvest or not to harvest, the moral dilemma that follows you throughout the Bioshock experience and defines the fate of the player. This choice lays at the center of your Bioshock story and has repercussions that can be felt in nearly every facet of the gameplay. Part of Bioshock's lasting legacy, of course, are the little sisters and this moral choice that presented itself to the player. Everyone became a water cooler conversation about, like, well, did you save them? Did you harvest them? That concept, Ken, was that something that came about early in development, or that binary choice? When did that come into the game?
I don't remember when. I mean, we had the concept of them being protected, but I can't remember when you actually
it certainly
chose.
wasn't. When there were slugs, it was not meaningful. I think there was...
Do you salt it? Do you
yeah,
not salt
yeah.
it?
There were resources that you could get, but there was no choice there, right? The choice was, do I want to fight the Big Daddy or not?
Yeah.
I think once we got into the realm of they have to be empathetic, the player has to have some feeling towards them, which you're not going to get from slugs. Right. Then we start seeing that opportunity there of, like, okay, nobody's going to want to do harm to these girls, or do they? Like, and do we allow them to? It was we weren't comfortable with it at first when it first came up that we could.
I think it was important that it was a way to reflect the sort of larger economic questions of a world like Rapture, where, like, where the economy drives everything. Are there any limits to economic decision making versus moral decision making? Because that's sort of what the Randian notion is, that it's not the role that you don't sort of legislate morality. Let's try to take that to an extreme and see where that ends up. And Little Sisters sort of became that. And in this world, they became a commodity. And the question we have for the players, are you willing, they're a commodity to you as well, potentially. Are you willing to participate in the commodification? There was, I think, a fair amount of nervousness internally at the publisher about it for a little while, but pretty quickly they were able to sort of say, look, we trust you guys, and go, do this. And I only had a few. The press, and this sort of happens over and over again, the games press worried a ton about it and, like, would wring their hands about it. They ever recognized it was a setting topic, but that it was done to a larger purpose, that it wasn't just sort of like, hey, this is the game where you kill children. And
whatever, and that was a sensitivity. I know that, like, you guys wanted to call them little sisters, not little girls, and it was and it wasn't, it wasn't killing them, it was harvesting them. And I mean, you did some things probably on purpose, right, to sort of explain that this, you weren't doing anything vicious to them, right?
Well, I mean, they do sort of disappear out of you, and a big slug out of their belly, comes up. That we didn't want that to be graphic. We wanted to be very clear that you were killing them.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. But it was not intended to be a prurient in terms of, hey, this is a simulation of pulling a sea slug out of a little girl's belly. But we wanted you to understand that you were making a very diabolical moral economic pact there. And we think that came across, and I think it came across well enough. And I think the test of how well it came across is, I think most people didn't really thought of it as am I willing to do this thing or not?
Right.
And people would tell us stories how, like, their girlfriend saw them harvesting, and then they literally slept on the couch that night. Right. And that's an interesting. That was interesting how people connected to a 3D mesh that's really no different than any other 3D mesh in the world. Like, this little sister, she's not a person. She's a 3D asset, a virtual 3D asset, right, that has a voice actor connected to it who's an adult woman. And nobody was actually getting harmed, but people still emotionally connected to them and made an emotional connection.
And also, I think when you're playing, you don't really know what the impact of that choice is.
Yes.
And that's sort of the curiosity of, like, you're a gamer, so it's like, am I going to game the system? Which one should I pick? How does this impact things as you go through the game? It's never really fully clear what that choice is going to lead to, right? And the ambiguousness of that was something you wanted to sort of create mystery around throughout the game?
Yeah, we went back and forth a lot about what the rewards for harvesting versus saving would be, and actually I think we should have really pushed further that the rewards for saving were much more, should have been much more meager than the rewards for harvesting, just to really sort of put you up against the wall, push you up against the wall and say,
Yeah.
you know, are you going to stick by your moral guns here? Because you're going to pay for it.
Yeah.
Because that's usually the way life is, right?
Yeah.
It's always harder to take a moral path than it is to take an amoral path. But there's incentives to take amoral paths because it's the easier path.
As you play through the game, eventually you get to the ending, and as we know now, there were sort of two endings that were affected by that choice. And that was something at the time, I know you said publicly that you weren't in favor of sort of having two endings. Was that in part because, the game is about not having choice, or did you think that, the two endings were, I don't know, like, I'm interested for narratively, like, why you didn't want to go that path?
It seemed forced, given that the game really sort of almost made a joke, a meta commentary joke about the lack of agency in games, the lack of meaning of those choices, given that you have these two endings. I guess you could make an argument that, well, you were free, you were given choice of the, once Ryan's dead, and that's really what it's about. But I think we also didn't really have enough time to execute on those super well. I was pretty happy with how the happier one came out, with the sort of little sister focus, but it's a much more subtle story than I would have time to tell about your slow descent into, moral chaos and dissolute living and all the things that sort of come along with a life that is sort of separate from a moral structure. It's a long story.
And so, you were just switching a cutscene. It wasn't like you were doing sort of a whole other level that was different or something. So the choice was...
There's two cutscenes with very tight time and economic
Or
constraints.
just start a nuclear war.
Yes. And that's not...
You're a nice guy, or you start a nuclear war.
And because we had so many problems on our plate, that was something I had to sort of do in the spare time. So I was pretty happy with one, but not very happy with the other.
I know you had said publicly before that there was another sort of more ambiguous ending that you had originally planned, or what would you have done?
There was a notion of an ambiguous ending, which if I just wrote one, I would have found a way that would just talk about the moral ambiguity of the world rather than the sort of, positive or negative, because it is such a, look, I think we really tried with Bioshock not to sort of make a game about good and evil. It was really about circumstances and what circumstances lead people to. Right. And how they delude themselves with ideology to do things that they would think are evil, but it's okay because it's for the good cause. Right. And that's what I probably would have. If I just had one to write, I'd probably focus more on that. How difficult it is to sort of align when you start being driven by ideology rather than being in the moment and thinking about the impact of what you're doing.
Right. Sean, you talked to gamers, I'm sure, over the years. Did you ever get a sense of how many people harvested versus saved, and was there any sort of data? This is before the days where you get telemetry and data on like what people picked and whatnot.
Yeah, anecdotally, it seems like more people saving Little Sisters. Although I have a few friends that are, I just harvested every single one. I wanted to see what happened. So I don't know if that was more, the game developer and them trying to see, what would happen, but certainly for the most part, I think most people. Which I guess is a good thing. It means that maybe people are good at heart. They kind of feel bad. They want they want to save the Little Sisters. So, yeah, I'll say it. The needle sways towards the green there.
Time for beddy-bye, Mr. B. Hurry, hurry, Mr. Bubbles.
The illusion of choice is a thinly veiled dynamic that drives many single-player gaming experiences. And while many developers spend a lot of time trying to convince players that choice is real and authentic in their games, the truth more often is that choice is a superficial concept in gaming narrative. Bioshock confronted this idea head-on, searing into our minds a innocuous 3-word phrase with an unforgettable new meaning. Would you kindly?
Of course, one of the most memorable moments in the game is the "Would you kindly" phrase and the reveal of how that's been motivating the player throughout the entire game. It's still, to me, one of the most classic kind of narrative moments in games in the past decade. What's interesting about that phrase is that it didn't always start like that. Can you tell us sort of about the evolution of sort of the the conditioning of the player? And there was once Excelsior was the phrase once.
Yeah, this is. I'm trying to recall some of this. So we had the idea, because we had the Andrew Ryan scene very early, and we knew sort of all the events that would happen. There were phrases before there was "Would you kindly." The notion existed and what it meant and what it was, but we didn't actually have the phrase "Would you kindly" until later. So we had a bunch of terms we threw in there. And like Excelsior was it for one point. That's probably comes from my Stan Lee fanboyism.
Was that like so throughout the game? It would have been like Excelsior.
Just randomly
There
say
there
that.
are some things when you're making games you just sort of throw in as like, we need
Sounds
something.
cool in a
We need
concept.
Why don't you head
something
over
here.
there, Excelsior?
And then it sits there
Yeah.
for a year.
Right.
And then all of a sudden you kind of forget it's not good, right? And then
Yeah.
until somebody comes along and says, dude.
Seriously?
Yeah.
What's
Or you meant it
Excelsior?
to be like a stub in. You never
Right.
meant
Yeah.
it to actually gain traction, and then you're like, oh crap.
But that sense of some phrase or word being repeated throughout the game that you wouldn't really realize its meaning
Yes.
Until later, that was there very early on.
Yes, yeah. And the fact that you would have something that seemed like a non-thing and then came back at you like a freight train later on it was there from pretty early.
Sit, would you kindly? Stand, would you kindly? Run. Stop. Turn. A man chooses. A slave obeys.
So that phrase evolved, but talk about that, the sort of meta-narrative of, being in a game, thinking that you have a sense of choice and making these decisions, but then obviously realizing that the player ultimately didn't have choice or was conditioned in a way that they would react to that. That was, sort of a new idea for a game. Where did that come from on your side, Ken? I mean, was there sort of a deeper sort of, meaning behind it?
No, look, I think I was always interested in the concept, whether it's, Oedipus, not to get too pointy-headed here, but Oedipus sort of thinking he has, I'm going to leave, this city and go to another city because there's been this prophecy about me and I'm going to avoid my fate and I'm in complete control, and then finding out he's not in control at all, to the Manchurian Candidate, which is a story I love about, somebody who you find out is just a puppet, living a life of a man, and Fight Club. I always love those kind of stories about who am I and what is my agency in this world, because look, we struggle. I think everybody struggles that. How much we really have control over, and how much is our boss or parents or whatever telling us what to do. So that seemed like a natural thing for a story, and because it came from movies, that idea a lot, and plays. Yeah. I don't think it was very. There was a lot of. It hadn't been explored in games really, and games are particularly interesting because
you feel like you are interacting with choice, yeah.
And you're really being, most games, especially at the time, you're really just being railroaded down a corridor. It's very easy to underestimate gamers, and I think probably I did a little of my own underestimation there, that it would be a little too pointy-headed for people, but people seem to really engage, because it spoke to an experience they had, a struggle as a gamer they've always had, which is like, I want to control, but how much control do I really have in this game?
True. And Sean, I mean, it was also something that, was a great surprise when you played through the game. And I'm sure even for people on the team, did everyone know that when Ken was sort of doing it, or did it was revealed as people played through it?
I think, at some point the entire team knew. It wasn't, it was something that was talked about with a smaller group before, it was brought to the entire team. Early on, when you heard the idea and you just kind of clicks, right? You're like, okay, like I totally get this.
Did people get it? I seem to remember people looking at me like I was like a lunatic.
Maybe not the specifics, and maybe it's the Excelsior, or you may be talking about the Excelsior time, but the idea that you don't really have choice, and exactly like you said, you played through how many video games, and everybody's game is going to end the same way. You're going to kill these people, you're going to pass through these checkpoints, and you think you have a choice, but ultimately the only real choice is to stop playing the game. So the idea that we're kind of like taking that on resonated. Now the actual, like, is it Excelsior, or is it the Latin phrase I forgot, or if it's would you kindly?
See, here's how I remember it, and I could be, I could be wrong.
Yeah.
I can remember being so surprised by the outside reaction, because I remember the internal reaction being completely nobody connected or engaged to it. I mean, we worked on it.
Yeah.
And so I was kind of surprised by the outside reaction because I kind of thought it was like, you know, as I said, it's a bit academic, right?
Yeah.
And well, look, it also could be a function of
We're playing it close to the vest.
I could be misremembering it, or it could also just be a function of nobody making the game had the experience of playing it through and getting to that moment.
Yeah, that's
I
what I mean. Like, it
mean,
was revealed to them in advance of really playing it, so it wasn't that surprise.
Yeah, they had seen it in all its really half-assed, you know, development stages
and
on the way.
out of order.
Yeah, out of order and all that.
And it's not really something you can play test over an afternoon because it takes a little while to get to that point.
You need to lack the knowledge about what the game is to be able to sort of have that experience all the way through. I know you guys have talked about you know, the idea of Atlas, the voice actor changing, and it was, I guess, very important that you nailed that actor, right? And you trusted that actor until there was sort of the Fontaine reveal and sort of understanding that.
Yes, trust was everything there, right? And so there was something about either the actor or the writing or the accent that just people immediately said, this guy's no good.
Right.
When the first Atlas we had, because you have to trust this guy, and at least if you know there's no trust, there's no punch in the gut. I think we've really focused on making him have personal stakes in the story as well. That he had his family trapped. Even, of course, it was all fiction, right? But his he had skin in the game. He sort of spoke to you as a friend, and especially because the whole world was so hostile to you. I think it took a while to get that exactly right.
Listen, I've got a family. I need to get them out of here. But the splicers have cut me off from them. If you can reach them in Neptune's bounty, then maybe, just maybe. I know you must feel like the unluckiest man in the world right now, but you're the only hope I'll ever see my wife and child again.
Sean, what do you hope is the kind of lasting legacy of Bioshock? You know, 10 years hence, a lot of things you guys were doing, you know, have sort of become common now, right? With, you know, upgrades and moral choices in games and whatnot. But it was really pioneering work a decade ago. When you reflect on it, what do you hope people remember the game for sort of pushing forward?
For me, it's telling a story with the medium and how we used everything available to us to tell that story. We used the environment to set up the backstory of Rapture and really create a sense of space, which I think is vitally important to getting the players to trust that, you know, to sit down and kind of like just be in the space and let these things happen. You know, even the radio logs, the rudimentary animation that we had at the time. I mean, we really sat down with the tools that we had and at our disposal and tried to tell a meaningful story. Maybe not meaningful, but something that would be memorable to people that they could take away and, like you said earlier, have that water cooler moment where they're excited enough to talk about it after they put the controller down. So for me, I think the legacy is that it was a story well told.
For me, it was a sense of place, being like the Rapture is a real thing, even though it's not. You know, it's actually a very crude, you know, from the time, you know, a relatively crude bunch of polygons and texture maps. You know, it's only, the original game is only in 720, I think. And I played a lot of it when we were testing it on a 14-inch, like, you know, SD television. That it still felt like a sense of place in the music and the characters, that it's a real place. And I think that my memories of the Bioshock games was that I take away that Rapture's a real place and Elizabeth's a real person. Those are the two sort of big things that stick with me with those two games. And that's sort of what I'll always, you know, carry forward with me in my life.
Bioshock is, you know, it's a place, but as we saw with Infinite, I mean, it's an idea and it's a sort of a type of game. I think a lot of people say like, oh, this is a, you know, a type of experience. When you think about, you know, your career, where you guys want to go, I mean, that idea of those types of games, do you miss it now that you've sort of moved on to other things now, or do you feel like it's sort of, you've closed that chapter?
I mean, it's always a part of what you do. Like, System Shock 2 was a part of Bioshock, but it wasn't System Shock 2. It was you know, you're growing past that and trying out new things. I think Bioshock and Bioshock Infinite, and even going back to SWAT 4, those will always be a part of my experience as a game developer and what we're trying to do with the medium. So I don't think it's something that you just draw a line and say, you know, we'll never return, because there's always lessons that you can learn and things that you bring with you to the next project that you're working on.
Yeah. I don't think the new game is going to, like, people are not going to be surprised that this game is, new games from us. They're going to see a lot of what we had done before in terms of world building and aspects of storytelling. The goal is to sort of, you know, move away from the you really have no choice kind of thing, and that's a very, 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 very hard problem, which we spent years working on. But we're building upon a foundation of stuff we've done before, just trying to go in a different direction with it. But it's always going to be part of our DNA.
City where the artist would not fear the censor, where the scientist would not be bound by petty morality, where the great would not be constrained by the small. And with the sweat of your brow, rapture can become your city as well.